Hello. I'm sure you can all appreciate the wide array of abiotic environments that animals have found a way to survive in. And today I'm going to be talking about how those abiotic environments can influence demography and life history of organisms. So we think a lot about abiotic constraints of temperature. There are really clear physiological mechanisms for the effect of hot or cold extremes. But another abiotic constraint is precipitation, and we think more often about a lack of precipitation as an environmental constraint. Drought is a well-known evolutionary driver, but too much rain can also influence fitness. And this might be particularly relevant in the tropics, where rain is the main axis of seasonality. So in a typical tropical rainforest, temperature will be quite constant throughout the year, and it's actually rainfall that varies dramatically throughout the months. This, of course, has implications for the plant communities in these places, but increasingly we're realizing it's also really important for the animals that are in these habitats. So we've come up with a framework to try to understand the interaction of precipitation and fitness, which we call the hygric niche, which just briefly is the idea that there's a specific range of precipitation conditions in which a species can persist. And so there may be some precipitation conditions where a species has optimal individual performance, and then outside of that range, the species is not viable and we don't find them. So that means that in response to changes in rainfall will depend upon where a population of the species is in its hygric niche. So a population, for example, over here towards the wet end of its hygric niche, in response to a year with more rain, might have lower demographic rates as opposed to a year with less rain, where it might have higher demographic rates as it'll be closer to optimum conditions for that species. So what this means, if we expand out to look at multiple species within a community at a single geographic location, is these are basically just collections of hygric niches. And so in that location, variation year to year in rainfall will result in different demographic responses depending upon where the species is within its hygric niche. So some species will have no change or very little change in response to differences in rainfall in a wetter year. In a wetter year, some species might have higher demographic rates, and conversely, other species might have reduced demographic rates as we move closer to this wetter condition in the species hygric niche. So I tested this idea with a data set from Rar Avis station on the Caribbean slope of Costa Rica. It's quite a rainy mid-elevation primary forest, and these data were collected between 2008 and 2013 by my PhD advisor, Alice Boyle, and colleague, Dr. Megan Jones. During the time that they were doing the study, the annual rainfall varied from 7 meters to 9 meters annually, and they amassed a capture mark recapture data set, which I was then able to use to construct Cormac jelly zebra models to estimate annual apparent survival for 7 species. These were the first published demographic estimates for 4 of these species to our knowledge. And so in addition to getting just this baseline demographic data, I was also really interested in looking at what the relationship between apparent survival and rainfall in the previous year might be. For 2 of those species, there was no change in the probability of apparent survival based on what the amount of rain that fell in the previous year was. For 2 species, they actually had higher probability of apparent survival following years with more rain. And then for 3 species, there was reduced apparent survival following rainier years. So as we had expected, rain was able to predict the demographic estimates of some species, but those responses went in different directions. And really understanding the mechanistic links between survival and precipitation is difficult without the context of behavior and life history to let us know what's actually shaping the hygric niche. And so to do that, I'm going to focus for the rest of the talk on the white ruffed manakin. This was a species that had no interannual variation in its estimates of apparent survival, but the mean estimate of 0.62 is really surprisingly low, given that this is a long-lived bird and we have known individuals to live for more than 10 years. It's also pretty surprising when compared to a different population of the same species, which has estimates of apparent survival of 90%. And so if we look at the rainfall regimes between these 2 places, it's pretty suggestive of potentially differences in rainfall regime influencing these baseline estimates of apparent survival. This might have repercussions for this species in particular because they are a lek mating species in which males are doing mating displays for females. In this species, it's a fallen mossy log that they display on. And each log has its own alpha dominant male. Sometimes males will have to be subordinate for a year or two before achieving dominant status. And their main goal is to perform for females. They will visit around at these different display logs. The collection of logs within auditory range of each other are what we call the lek. But even before males have an opportunity to display for females, they sort of have to go through a little bit of maturation. So in their second year, they basically look like females all over green. In their third year, they start to get the zoromask, and then it's not till after that third year that they have their glossy blue-black plumage and will display for females. And then, of course, even if they display for females and are dominant in a log, there's no guarantee that they will actually be chosen as mates. So we know that rain does influence these birds physiologically. We see evidence of fasting and mortality after big storm events. We also know that many times males will migrate to lower elevations to escape the heaviest rainfall, but then when they come back for the next breeding season, they lose status and females actually prefer to mate with males that do not migrate. In addition, behavioral data from this population shows that they have really dynamic social hierarchies. So the individual identity of the male who is alpha at a given display site frequently changes from year to year. And there's also high turnover in which display sites they use. So they'll transition to a different display site pretty frequently. So all of this combined to make me really interested in how rain might be contributing to the variability that we see in display behavior in this species. And so the potential hypotheses include indirect rain effects affecting the structure of the forest and the availability of display sites, direct mortality effects of rain influencing the turnover in the population, or non-lethal effects of rain, which could result in changes in energetic budgets and behavioral changes, which could manifest in differences in male investment in display or female investment in mate choice. So to test these hypotheses, I set up a field site at Volcan Tenorio National Park, which is just 100 or so kilometers from Rara Avis and gets a little over half as much rain annually. And so in 2016, I went and color banded a whole heap of birds and then did behavioral observations between 2017 and 2019, trying to match as closely as possible what had been done at the rainier site, RA, between 2008 and 2013. So this consisted of finding display logs, doing observations from blinds, and recording everything that happened during those observations. We put in a lot of time in blinds. All of the behavioral metrics will be presented as either proportion of time in a given year or a rate per 100 hours to account for differences in effort. And during those observations, we realized that while it's less rainy at Tenorio, it is surprisingly windy. And we also had the experience of an extreme weather event between our 2017 and 2018 breeding season, Tropical Storm Nate, which had a profound effect on Costa Rica as a whole, and at our field site resulted in some localized damage to the primary forest. And so with that in mind, I've shown data from that year as a triangle. And I should also note that data from the drier site, Volcan Tenorio, is going to be shown in yellow, and the rainier site, Rara Avis, will be shown in blue. So our first hypothesis for how rain might indirectly influence behavior through turnover in available display logs. So in a rainier environment, we might expect faster decomposition, more frequent tree fall, would increase the frequency of males having to find new display sites. So in a less rainy environment, maybe those changes between display logs would happen less frequently. But what we see, in fact, again, so these are the Rara Avis values in blue here, and the drier site in yellow is the proportion of logs that become inactive between years is actually overall higher at the drier site than in any of the years at the rainy site. And again, in this year immediately following Tropical Storm Nate, over half of the display logs that I had found in year one were inactive for one reason or another, which I'll get into in a moment. So this definitely does not fit our prediction for the hypothesis of indirect rain effects, and in fact moves in the opposite direction with higher turnover at the drier site. So why do display logs become inactive? This can be tree or branch fall, decomposition or overgrowth of vegetation, and then sometimes they're just abandoned for no physical reason that we can see. Logs will also be abandoned due to changes in the canopy structure around them. So this was a log active in 2017. After the storm, this huge tree, you can just see the roots here, toppled over and totally changed the lighting conditions at the log, and it was no longer being used. So if we look at the proportion of basically log fates across years and sites, we see that the logs are abandoned for a similar rate between the two sites, but at the drier site, there's a higher proportion of logs that either decompose, have trees or branches fall on them, or become inactive due to changes in the canopy around them. Rain might more directly influence behavior and variability at display sites through mortality. So we might expect that if there's higher mortality, reduced survival in a rainier environment, then who the alpha is at a given display log is probably going to have to change more frequently as the turnover in the male population is higher than it is in a less rainy population where there's potentially higher survival. However, what we see is that although there is this really, again, this is kind of a common theme, dramatic interannual variation within the rainy site, at the drier site, those values fall kind of well within the range of what we observe at the rainy site in terms of turnover of alpha males at a given display log. So this doesn't seem to be a site level difference. They're very similar rates of turnover. Another way, however, to look at turnover in the male population is distribution of male age and capture. So if we're in an environment where there's pretty high mortality, we might expect consistent turnover in the proportion of captures that are made up of adult males. There might be more young males, whereas in a population that has higher survival, then those adult males likely continue to survive year after year after year, again, up to 10 years, making up a higher proportion of the males in that population. And we do see that adult males at the drier site tend to make up a higher proportion of captures within that site than at the rainy site. So this is suggestive and consistent with direct effects of rain and mortality influencing the composition of the males in that population. Unfortunately, I didn't have the data to be able to do more robust analyses of Cormack jelly zebra models, etc. But this is consistent with our predictions for this population. And so, of course, rain might have non-lethal effects on individuals. Differences in resource availability or energetic costs could alter behavior, which we might manifest itself in differences in male investment in display. So we might measure that as the time that males spend attending their display log, ready and waiting if a female should show up. And so if we are in a less rainy environment, maybe there's fewer energetic constraints, and so males might be expected to spend more time at their display log at the ready. However, we see, again, really wide variation year to year at the rainy site. At the dry site for 2 years, the proportion of time that males spend at their display log is towards the upper limit of what we see at the rainy site, with this 1 year, again, right after Tropical Storm Nate, being much lower. So this was intriguing because when we arrived to that field site after Tropical Storm Nate, we realized that these plants that are really fundamental to manakin diet had experienced some pretty striking phenological shifts. All of the reproductive structures of these plants had been stripped. And so we did sort of a quick and dirty survey to look at the availability of fruit for individuals at the beginning of the field season, the breeding season, right after the storm, and then the year after. And of course, an event like this will have consequences beyond a single year, but it is pretty intriguing that there is a qualitative difference in the amount of resources available to those birds between these 2 years. So it's possible, a little ambiguous at this point, but it's possible that there may be differences that were obscured by that extreme event. Then finally, sort of the million-dollar question, of course, is how is female behavior influenced by potentially, again, these energetic costs and changes? And we might measure that by looking at the amount of time that females spend assessing their prospective mates in the population. And so in a less rainy environment with fewer energetic constraints, perhaps females spend more time reviewing all of their options. But what we see is that females at the rainy site and at the dry site spend nearly identical proportion of time checking out males at the display log, which was surprising to me. Again, there's a bit of interannual variation, but the range and the values are nearly identical between sites. So this doesn't seem to be a consistent site level distinct difference between these sites. So to review, I don't think we have evidence that female investment is influenced by these direct rain effects. It's a little ambivalent in terms of male investment in display, given our sort of unusual data set. For differences in survival affecting turnover in the population, if we look at the age distribution, I think that is suggestive of some differences between the two sites. And then if we look at indirect rain effects on the display sites themselves, I think if we think about just rain, obviously that was totally in opposition to our predictions. But if we think more about how the abiotic environment and the climate are influencing forest structure and expand that to consider the windiness of the drier site and the extreme weather event, I think we do see that these changes in the forest structure have consequences for the stability of the display sites that these birds are using. And so overall, I think what we come away with is this picture of a system in which these birds are contending with a lot of variability consistently all across the board. So if we look at the combined proportion of logs that either become inactive or change alpha, it's at minimum 62% for any of these years, but compared to other manakins where it can be as low as 32%. So this is a really striking difference, and the rainy mid-elevation forest that they are persisting in is just inherently dynamic potentially, and these wind and extreme events were something we didn't foresee, but I think it's a good reminder that this extreme occurrences could explain some of the interannual variability that we see, and a reminder that the distribution of rainfall as well as the total amount is really important to consider if we're thinking about organismal fitness, as these can increase, and important to think about how those can influence these organisms. And finally, I think overall, just keeping in mind how the abiotic environment can interact with demography to influence the evolutionary trajectories and the selected forces that these organisms are contending with is really critical to keep in mind. And so with that, I have many people to thank: intrepid field assistants, funding sources, colleagues in Costa Rica, and if I have time, I would be happy to take any questions. Thank you.